Hi and welcome to this course. My name is Maximilian Schwarzmuller and I will be your instructor in this course. Now this course is about Next.js, a framework for React.js. And that might sound strange because React.js itself already is a JavaScript library. But over the next lectures, I will explain what exactly Next.js is and why using it could be a good idea. Now I can already say that learning it is a good idea though, because Next.js is super popular and it does make building React apps, large-scale React apps, but also small React apps way easier. Because it will give you solutions for common problems which you have to solve over and over again and which you'll face in basically any React project you might be working on. Therefore, Next.js is amazing, it is super popular, and in this course you're going to learn it from the ground up, step by step. You don't need to know anything about Next.js to get started, and you will get all the theory, the behind-the-scenes knowledge, small demos and examples, and also bigger projects in this course to ensure that by the end of the course, you know how to use Next.js, you know why you use it, what its core features are, and you will be able to build your own Next.js projects once you're finished with this course. Now to see what's in the course, just continue because I got an entire lecture where I walk you through the course and the content of this course, and of course also have a look at the course curriculum. This course is packed with knowledge, and therefore let's not waste any time and let's dive right in, and let's start with the most important question first. What exactly is Next.js and why is using it maybe a good idea?
So what is Next.js? And why could learning Next.js be a good idea? And why could Next.js in general be helpful to us as a React developer? If we visit Next.js.org, the official Next.js website, we learn that Next.js is the React framework for production. Okay, so that sounds like a good argument. We all want to build production apps, right? So Next.js is certainly helpful then, but wait a second. What exactly does this mean? So Next.js calls itself a React framework for production, and that name makes a lot of sense because Next.js offers a lot of features that make building large-scale production-ready React apps easier, but I personally also like to call Next.js a full-stack framework for React.js. And it's the full-stack part which I want to highlight here. But I will come back to that. Let's first of all focus on the framework part. Isn't React.js itself already a framework or a library? Well, indeed it is. React is labeled a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And that means that it's a third-party package which you can add to your front-end projects. So it's all about client-side JavaScript code in the end. And you can use React there to build interactive user interfaces. And it's a library that makes building complex user interfaces way easier than it would be with just JavaScript. I get separate courses and videos on React where I explain why React is awesome. So I'll not focus on this here. So React already is such a library, and it's called a library because in its core, it's really only focusing on that user interface part, on components, state, props. If you want to build large-scale React projects, you typically also need to add extra libraries for routing, maybe libraries that help you with authentication, and things like that. Now, Next.js is labeled a framework and a framework that builds up on React. Now, the difference between a framework and a library in the end is that a framework is bigger. It has more features than a library. It's focusing on more things instead of just a single thing. And it's also giving you clear rules, a clear guidance on how you should write your code, how you should structure your files, and so on. And all these are things which Next.js does, as you're going to learn throughout this course. But it's also a framework building up on another library already, on React, because it enhances React, you could say. It makes building large-scale React apps easier. And that's the part where we're back on this for production part here. Next.js has the goal to make the life easier for you as a React developer. And it builds up on React, it enhances React by adding many core features which you have to add to React apps on your own otherwise. Things like routing, but also many other things. And I'll come back to that in just a second. And we're going to dive into the key features added by Next.js. But Next.js simply adds a lot of features to your React app. They then are there out of the box once you start using Next.js, and it therefore ensures that you don't have to reinvent the wheel as often. You don't have to add as many third-party libraries to solve common problems which you need in bigger apps and which you typically need to solve when building real production React apps. And that's why Next.js is called a framework, because it has a lot of features, clear rules. Why it's a framework for React, because it builds up on React, it enhances React, it uses React, you still write React code, you still build React components. But it's a framework for production because it adds all those missing features which you typically do need to add to React apps to really prepare them for production and to solve common problems. And with that, let's now take a closer look at the actual features added by Next.js so that we understand where it helps us exactly and why using it is a great idea and makes our life easier. So let's have a look at the Next.js key features and benefits. And whilst we go through them, it will also become clearer why I like to call Next.js a full-stack framework as well. I would say the most important key feature Next.js adds is the built-in server-side rendering support. Now, in case it's not clear what server-side rendering means, server-side rendering is all about preparing the content of a page on the server instead of on the client. If you take a standard React application built with just React, then if you inspect the source code of a loaded React page, you will notice that the page is actually pretty empty right from the start. You only have a basic HTML skeleton there, and then some entry point, some div with an ID root typically, into which the React app is loaded and rendered. But all of that rendering is done by React, and since React is a client-side JavaScript library, all that rendering happens on the client. So in the browsers of your users, it's not happening on the server. And as a result, the actual HTML code, which is sent from the server to the client when a user visits your page, is pretty empty. Now, that is not necessarily a big problem. It depends on what you're building, but it can be a problem. Because, for example, if your page also fetches some data from a server that should be displayed, like a list of meetups as we're doing it here, then the user might initially see some loading state, a flickering page for a fraction of a second whilst the request is on its way fetching the data, because data fetching only begins once the JavaScript code executed on the client, and then we still have to wait for the response of that outgoing request. Simply because the page which we requested did not yet contain that data. Now, again, that is not necessarily a problem, but of course it might not be the user experience you want to offer. Now, it can also be a problem if search engine optimization matters to you. Now, this does not matter for all pages. If you have an administration dashboard, which is only reached by logging in, then search engine optimization does not matter there because search engines will never see that dashboard. It's highly user-specific and you need to log in anyways. But if you have a public-facing page with a lot of content that should be found through search engines, then of course search engine optimization does matter. So for example here, where we got this list of meetups, we see those meetups as a user, but the search engine crawlers will actually only see that initially empty HTML page which we're getting from a server. So that content is not picked up by search engine crawlers, and that can be a problem. And that's where server-side rendering could help us. If that page would be pre-rendered on the server, if that data fetching somehow could be done on the server when a request hits that server, and then the finished page would be served to our users and to the search engine crawlers, then users would not have that flickering loading state, and search engines would see our page content. And that's the problem server-side rendering solves. It allows us to pre-render React pages, React components on a server. Now, React.js actually has built-in features that allow you to add server-side rendering, but it can be tricky to get that right, and it requires extra setup from your side. With Next.js, that becomes way easier because Next.js has built-in server-side rendering. It automatically pre-renders your pages. And that means that with Next.js, if you build a standard Next.js app without any extra setup from your side, if you visit such a page, it was pre-rendered on the server by default out of the box. And that means that it's great for search engine optimization because search engines see what our users see, and our users also have a better initial load experience because they don't have that initial flickering. If we inspect the source code of a Next.js page, so of a page in a Next.js app, then we see that there, it's not just an empty HTML skeleton, but instead all the content is already there in that HTML page, which we got back from the server. Now, it is worth noting that with Next.js, after this initial load, after this initial request, we still get a standard React app running in the browser, a standard single-page application even. Subsequent navigation actions by the user, so when the user then browses our page and navigates around, those actions are all handled by React in the browser to have this fast, interactive user experience which we typically want to offer with React, which was one of the reasons why you would use React typically. So we still get that, but for the initial load, we have that pre-rendered page. And that in the end means that client-side and server-side code is kind of blended together with Next.js. And of course, in this course, you are going to learn how things are blending together, how you can write code that runs on the server and how you can write code that runs on the client. You are, of course, going to learn all about that. And this is therefore one of the major features that makes up Next.js, this built-in server-side rendering, which on its own probably would already be a strong benefit or a strong reason for why you might want to use Next.js for building your React projects instead of just React.js. But it's not the only key feature. Another very nice feature added by Next.js is file-based routing. Now, what does this mean? In traditional React, you don't even have a router. And just to be clear, routing means that we give the user the illusion of having multiple pages. When we navigate around and we load different pages, then that's the job of a router. Typically, we use React Router for that. This router basically watches the URL, and when it changes, it basically prevents the browser default of sending a request to some backend server, and instead renders different content on the page with React, a different component in the end. That's what routing is. We change what's visible on the screen based on the URL without sending an extra request to a server, because we stay in that single page application which we typically build with React. Now that's routing, and typically with React, routing is set up in code. That code could look something like this, depending on the version of React Router you're using. Now this works, and it's not bad, not wrong. React Router is a great package, but it is extra code which you have to write. And then often you end up storing your components that act as pages in a separate folder, which kind of replicates your route setup in code. So if you have 3 pages set up as pages in code, you have 3 page components in that pages component folder. Makes sense, I guess. Now, since that's the case, Next.js gets rid of that in-code route definition. Instead, with Next.js, you define pages and routes with files and folders. You have a special pages folder in Next.js apps, which has to be named pages, and then your structure in that folder defines the routes and paths your page supports. And of course, we're also going to learn how that works in this course. Now, that simply allows us to get rid of that extra code, and hence we have to write less code, we have less work, and it's a highly understandable concept because it's very close to how we all started with web development. When you're getting started with just HTML and CSS and some basic JavaScript maybe, then you build basic websites by adding multiple HTML files, and the names of these files or the folders in which they sit define how you can navigate between these files, how you can link these files together. And Next.js basically allows us to go back to this very basic yet understandable concept of routing. And Next.js still supports all the features we might want, like nested routes or dynamic routes with dynamic parameters and all of that. And we're going to see that in this course, of course. Now, Next.js has more amazing features, but the last key feature, which I want to point out here, is the feature which is most important for me labeling Next.js a full stack framework. Because Next.js also makes it easy for us as a developer to add backend code to our React project. So to build a full stack React project where we don't just have the client-side code, maybe with server-side pre-rendering, but where we also have standalone backend code that, for example, works with the file system or reaches out to a database. With Next.js, it's very easy to add our own backend API into our React project using Node.js code. So we can easily add such code to our next React apps when using Next.js. And that allows us to add code for storing data to a database or to files, getting data from there, adding authentication, and all of that. That's easy to add with Next.js. We can stay in one project. We have to know some Node.js code for that, arguably, but we would have to know that anyways when we build our own backend. And then we don't have to build a standalone REST API project, but instead we can work on one project, our next project, and add all the client-side code, our React user interface, and also blend in our backend API code. That's why Next.js is amazing, and these are all the core features I wanted to point out here, and which we're of course going to learn about in depth in this course, and even more than that. So now that we know what Next.js is, and now that we at least have a first idea of why we might want to use Next.js, let's get started with it and let's create a first Next.js project. For this, we just need to run one simple command in the end, this command here, but to run this command, we need to have Node.js installed. Now, we're not going to write any Node.js code, at least not right now. We will write some basic code later, but we'll not write it right now. But Node.js ships together with the Node Package Manager, which is an extra tool, which is the de facto standard tool for installing and managing libraries in JavaScript projects. And we will use that tool to create the next project, and that created next project under the hood will also need Node.js to execute. For example, for that built-in server-side rendering, that uses Node.js under the hood. And for all those reasons, we need to install Node.js. And for that, you can simply visit nodejs.org, and from that page, you can install the latest version of Node.js, whatever that version is when you're viewing that. Just install the latest version, simply click on there and download Node.js. It is available for all major operating systems. And then walk through that installer once that download finished. Now, once you have Node.js installed, you are ready to run this command. And therefore, we can now go to the terminal, to your regular command prompt, which is built into your operating system. And there you can cd and navigate into the folder where you want to create your next project. And then simply run this command, npx create-next-app. Run this command by hitting enter, and this will now create a new next project in that folder where you ran that command. Now, you might be prompted to confirm that you're installing extra packages, and hence I will confirm this here. And now this will temporarily install the Create Next App tool and then start creating that project. Now for this, we first of all need to give this project a name. And I'll just use Next.js-course here as a name, but you can of course pick any name you want. Hit enter, and now this project will be created here, and it will set up a base folder for that project and install all the core dependencies this project will need. Now, once it's done, you can run the commands shown here to start your development server, but I will not yet do that here. Instead, I now opened this project in Visual Studio Code, the IDE, the editor I'm going to use in this course. Now, you don't have to use Visual Studio Code. It is a great IDE for web development, though. It's completely free and it's amazing, but you can use whatever your favorite web development IDE is. If you do want to use the same editor as I do here, though, you can visit code.visualstudio.com. And from there, you can download Visual Studio Code. It is available for all major operating systems. Simply download the installer and walk through it. And once you have downloaded and installed it, you can open that Next.js course folder, which we created with the command here in the terminal with Visual Studio Code. Now here I'm using the dark theme. You can change this under Preferences Color Theme. Here I am using the Dark Plus theme. And I also adjusted the appearance. You can do that under View, Appearance, and simply adjust it as you want. And for example, show or hide the status bar. I'm hiding it, but that is something you can configure however you want. Now regarding extensions, that's a great feature of Visual Studio Code. You can install extensions there. And the only extension that I'm using here and that I recommend that you install is the Prettier extension. You can simply search for Prettier here. And that's an extension that will help you with code formatting. So with automatically transforming your code to look cleaner and to be more formatted and structured. Once you installed that extension, you just need to make sure that you go to your keyboard shortcuts and there search for Format Document and make sure that you have that shortcut set up, because that's a shortcut which I will press all the time, which will then auto-format my code and use Prettier. And to make sure that I do use Prettier, under Preferences Settings in your user or workspace, so project-specific settings, you can also search for Format and make sure that under Default Formatter, you do pick Prettier here. Here it is. So with that all set up, you will have the same setup as I do, and that is the setup I will use in this course. That is the setup we will use throughout all the lectures, and it is the setup which we'll now use to dig a bit deeper into this project we just created. So we did create that Next.js project here in the terminal with npx create next app. And that gave us a folder which looks like this, which has this kind of content. Attached, you also find that starting project in case it changes over time or looks slightly different because the starting template was changed, for example. So attached, you find that exact project snapshot which I have here. If you do download the attached snapshot, though, there is one extra step you need to go through. You need to open the terminal, and you can use the one built into Visual Studio Code, which is your default terminal, your default command prompt, which ships with your operating system, just already integrated into Visual Studio Code, and conveniently also already navigated into this project folder. So any commands you run here will execute in the context of your project folder. And here you then need to run npm install if you use that attached snapshot, because that will then install all the dependencies of this project as defined here in package.json and store them and their dependencies in the node modules folder. So that's also a folder in which will never work. The three important folders for us here are pages, public, and styles, though pages is by far the most important one. Styles, as you might guess, holds some style files. We can ignore that for now. We'll work on that soon. And public simply holds public resources our page might use, something like images, for example. Now, one thing you might see here in public, though, is that unlike in a regular React app, which you, for example, created with Create React App with that extra tool, that there in a standard React app, you have a index.html file in the public folder. Here in the Next.js app, you don't have that. And the reason for this is that Next.js has this built-in pre-rendering, and whilst it gives you a single page application, that single page is dynamically pre-rendered when a request reaches the server, so that you do return an initial page with content. That is what I talked about earlier in this course as well, this server-side rendering and the pre-rendering of pages. And hence for us, the pages folder will be the most important folder, because that is where we will set up that file-based routing, and that is therefore the folder which is important for us to define the different pages that should make up our application here. Now we are going to dive super deep into Next.js throughout this entire course. Nonetheless, I think it's also pretty nice to get our hands dirty now already and to at least explore how a Next.js app works and behaves. And for this, in this project which we created, in this terminal navigated into this project folder, we can now run npm run dev. This runs one of the built-in scripts which we find here in the package.json file, and npm run dev spins up our development server. That is a built-in server which serves our Next.js pages and the overall application. It will watch our code, and whenever we save changes to files, it will automatically reload and update the pages we see in the browser, and it will in general give us a great development experience. Later, once we're ready to deploy our application, we're going to run npm run build to build it for production, to produce an optimized output for deployment, and npm start later then to start this optimized server. Because we are working with a real server here, a Node.js based server, since we need that page pre-rendering which happens on the server. But that is already a little bit too much right now. We are going to dive into that throughout the course, and we are going to learn how to deploy and so on. And therefore right now, let's use this dev script and spin up that development server. Now this will then serve this next application by default on localhost 3000, as you see in the output down there. And therefore you can visit localhost 3000 and you should see something like this. The exact starting screen could change over time, but it should be something like this. And if you are using my attached snapshot, you will definitely see this. Now what we see on this screen is actually the result of this index.js file in the pages folder. In there, we have a regular React component, a functional component, which returns JSX just as we know it from React. But this component here is actually now pre-rendered. And hence, if we view the page source here in localhost 3000, we find all that content which we see on the screen, all that text and so on, here in the HTML markup. Because this page was pre-rendered, because I did mention that this would be one of the key features offered by Next.js, this built-in page pre-rendering, which we don't have in standard React apps. So out of the box, we got this, and we can now start working on this project here or on this page. And since it is a regular React component, we can do whatever we can do with React components. Manage state, render different JSX content for different states, and so on. But since we're going to dive way deeper into all these core features and into how we build a Next.js application with multiple pages and with other React components, since we are going to dive into all of that, I will keep this first example very simple. And I will simply clear all the content we have in this main div here. All that content, I'll clear it so that only the div is left and get rid of this import, which we don't fully understand yet, but which we will reintroduce later. And then here in this div, I'll just add a h1 tag where I say hello next world. And if we now save this save is picked up, the dev server updates the page, and we now see this on the screen. And again, if we view the page source, we also find this text content here in the source code, so that pre-rendering still works out of the box. And that's our first Next.js application, our first Next.js project. Arguably not too exciting, but we are going to dive way deeper into Next.js in the next course sections now. Now, before we dive into all those Next.js features and learn them in depth, I want to give you a general overview of what you can expect from this course and which content will be in this course. Of course, also simply go through the curriculum, which you can see, to see what's included in the course and when you're going to learn what. But in general, you could say that this course has three main types of content, three main content blocks. We have the basics and foundation block, which is about all these key features you have to know when working with Next.js, and where I will introduce those key features with theory and small examples. We then also dive into many more advanced concepts throughout this course, the concepts which you will need for your real apps you're building, for the production-ready apps you're building. And we'll also have summary content. So summaries and refreshers, which are there to save your time, to allow you to quickly summarize what you learned, or to fill gaps which you might have, for example, related to React. Now, in the course modules that make up this basics and foundation block, and that's important, by the way, these blocks are not the course sections, but the categories you could group those course sections into. We will have more course sections than what you will see on this slide. Here, I'm just outlining the main concepts and categories of content you will learn. So in this basics and foundation block of content, you will, for example, learn about file-based routing. We will have a course section on that. We are, of course, also going to take a very close look at page pre-rendering, server-side rendering, and fetching data for page pre-rendering. So preparing and fetching data on the server side instead of on the client side, and when to use which approach, because it turns out that we will have different approaches and different solutions here. We will also explore how we can combine Next.js features and Next.js pages with standard React features, standard React components, and features like context and refs and everything that makes up React. And you'll see that it is very straightforward and very easy. Nonetheless, we're going to take a look at that as well. And we are also going to explore API routes and how we can build full stack applications with Next.js. So these are all the core concepts which we'll explore in depth throughout this course. But then we're also going to dive into advanced concepts. We are going to explore optimization opportunities, for example. How we can set page metadata, how we can optimize images so that we serve small images and load them lazily, things like that. We are going to look behind the scenes and explore some theory. In this course, you're not just going to learn how to do something, but also why and what happens behind the scenes. We are, of course, also exploring deployment and configuring our app for deployment, different ways of building a Next.js application, and I will show you a detailed deployment example from A to C, where we at the end have our Next.js project up and running on a production server. In this course, we are also going to explore authentication and how you can add authentication to your Next.js project, because it turns out that it works a bit differently than in standard React apps, that it's easier than in standard React apps, and you're going to learn what's easier and how it works in this course. And then regarding those summaries and refreshers, as I said, they are there to save you time and fill gaps. Because, for example, this course includes a full React.js refresher module. Actually, that will be the next module after this course section. And you can, of course, skip that React.js refresher if you already know React, if you have no gaps, and if you're ready to dive into Next.js. But if it has been some time since you last worked with React, if you especially have no experience or not enough experience with functional components and React hooks, or if you only have basic React knowledge in general, then this React.js refresher module is there for you to ensure that we're all on the same page. So definitely go through that next module in that case. If you already have a solid understanding of React.js, if you know functional components and React hooks, then you can skip it. And at the end of the course, you will also find a Next.js summary module, which summarizes all those key features again, and which therefore ensures that if you're coming back to this course in a couple of months or even years, you got a quick way of going through all these key features again without having to go through the entire course again. And even if you just finished the course, that summary module can be very nice for quickly wrapping up the course and again making sure that you fully understood all those key features and that you have the best possible preparation for building your own Next.js projects. Now that's the content. All this content will be taught with theory and small demos and examples, but we will then also have multiple bigger projects, more realistic projects, where we also apply what we learned, so that you have both small focused examples and the theory, and then the bigger picture where everything comes together. And you also, of course, should practice what you learned. From time to time throughout this course, I will challenge you to try out something on your own, but I also challenge you right now to do this even if I don't tell you to try something on your own. Consider pausing the course and the videos from time to time and try out the next steps on your own without looking at my solution first. So definitely also take a hands-on approach on your own and apply what you learned in your own projects outside of this course and also in the bigger course projects before we then build them together throughout this course. This will then ensure that you really understand what you're learning. Now, there is one special thing about this course which I want to highlight. You got two main options for going through that course, for taking that course. You have the standard approach, which is the approach which I recommend. There you start at lecture 1 in section 1. I guess you already did this, but then you continue going through this course step by step, lecture by lecture. You can skip the React.js refresher module if you don't need it, of course, but if you need to fill some gaps, also go through that course section. And then at the end of this course, you have that Next.js summary module, which I mentioned. There I will walk you through all the core features again, will again build a small mini project again, and you will basically get a quick overview of what you learned and of all the core features. That is a great course section to take once you're done with the course, which is why it is at the end of the course, to quickly get a quick overview of the entire core concepts again. And it's also a great module to come back to in the future if you took the course a couple of months ago and you quickly want to go through it again without going through the entire course again, which is, of course, not that short. And that's the standard approach which I recommend, that you simply go through that course and then take the summary module as a, well, summary module. But you can also take the summary approach, as I'd like to call it. We could also call it the quick start approach, which you can go for if you're in a hurry, if you have limited time, if you want to learn the essence of Next.js as quickly as possible. For this approach, you should skip all the next modules up to this Next.js summary module. Only take the React.js refresher module first if you need it, so take that first and then the Next.js summary module if you need to refresh your React.js knowledge. Otherwise, skip that React.js refresher module as well and move forward to the Next.js summary module. With that, you will then learn the essence of Next.js, the core features that make up Next.js in the shortest time possible. You will still get a mini project there, but of course we're not going to dive into Next.js as deeply as we do it in the entire course. This module is built such that you can go through it first without taking the entire course first. It is built such that it works standalone. And it then summarizes the core concepts Next.js has to offer, of course, without diving as deeply into those concepts and into your different configuration options as the rest of this course does. This course section, this summary section, will also not include all the features I cover in this course in general. Will not dive into authentication there or image optimization, for example, simply because it is a summary module, an overview module. This course is as long as it is for a good reason, and therefore the summary module does not replace this course. But if you just want to get a quick overview of Next.js, if you want to quickly dive into it and learn about the core features, and you want to dive deeply into the course later, you can go for this summary approach and go through this summary module first, and then possibly come back to the entire course at a later point of time to go through that as well. Now, as I mentioned, my recommended approach is the left one though. That is the approach with which you will get the most out of this course. That is the approach with which you will really learn Next.js in depth. But if you're in a hurry, you can go for the right approach instead. Now, last but not least, to conclude this first introductory course section, I want to make sure that you get the most out of this course. I want to ensure that you have a great learning experience and that you're able to learn Next.js in the best possible way. And therefore, I got a couple of recommendations and tips and tricks for you to ensure that this is the case. Now, obviously, this is a video-based course. It's a video on-demand course, and therefore you should take advantage of this. You should, of course, watch all those lectures, preferably in order, and you should watch them at your pace. Set your own speed. You can use the video player controls to speed me up or slow me down if I'm going too fast. It is also perfectly fine and normal to pause and rewind and to go back to earlier lectures to ensure that you really understand what I'm explaining. If something is not clear after watching a video, watch the video again. That is a normal part of learning. Repetition is a normal part of learning, and therefore you should use the fact that this is a video on demand course and that you can watch videos as often as you want. But if you want to get the most out of the course, don't just watch the videos, also code along and practice, even without me telling you. I will sometimes challenge you to try out something on your own, but I do recommend that you always code along, that you pause the videos often and try out the next steps on your own before we write code together. Now, of course, there will be failures with that approach, but that is how you learn the most. So definitely consider coding along and practicing. Now, when you run into errors and problems, try to solve those on your own. Really, that is the biggest part of learning, fixing errors and problems on your own. don't ask for help immediately. You will learn way more if you solve problems on your own. I would even argue that solving problems is the most important skill as a successful developer. So therefore, use Google, use Stack Overflow, use resources like this to find out what could be causing a problem in your code. And also use my code attachments, which you find on the last lecture of every module. My code is attached as a GitHub repository. In the last lecture of every module, you will find links to this GitHub repository, to different branches there, where the different branches represent the different course sections. And then in a given branch, let's say in the authentication branch here, you can always go to commits here on the right, and you will see the different code snapshots which I created when I recorded that course section. And you can then always click on this button here to browse this code repository at this point. And then you find my code snapshot at this point in the course section. You can then also download it as a zip file or clone the repository. And these commit messages here, which I left here, should help you find out to which part of a section, so to which lecture, a specific code snapshot belongs. If you just watched the lecture where we added logout and you want to compare your code after this lecture with mine, it's probably this commit which you want to use. So that's how you should use my code attachments when using my code to compare it to yours. Now, of course, there might be problems which you just can't solve, where you don't find the reason for the problem. And in this case, definitely use the fact that you're in a community of developers. Help each other and learn together. We got a Discord channel. A link can be found attached and in an earlier lecture in this course. We got a Discord channel which you can join for free to discuss with fellow developers, share projects, help each other, and of course also discuss matters that are not related to this course. It's a general learning-oriented Discord channel after all. And you can of course also use the Q&A board which comes with this course to post any other problems you might have and to also help others there. Because ultimately, helping others, solving problems on your own, coding along and watching the videos at your pace, that is what will ensure that you will get the most out of this course.